days, we didn't have websites with jobs on there. We had newspapers. And they would show me the newspaper with all the job ads on there. And I would look at them and say, no, no, no. I would just simply say, well, I can do these office tasks, but why would they want to employ me? I am deaf. So my tutors knew that I needed something. I needed some support in understanding what disability meant. So I was enrolled in a compulsory disability equality training workshop. And that was really interesting because in addition to learning about disability, I had to look forward to some mock interviews where I was expected to practice how to sell myself and sell my skills to potential employers, which was quite daunting for me. But at the beginning of the workshop, they shared something that was vitally important for me. It became incredibly important for me in my life, something called the social model of disability. What does that mean? Essentially, the disabled community in the UK believes that disabled people are just simply part of humanity. People with impairments, with health conditions, have existed throughout the history of the world. But what is disabling them is the lack of accessibility, the lack of access into employment, into education. And therefore, what is disabling them is exactly that. It's not their fault. It's not inherent in them, the lack of participation. It is something that the lack of accessibility prevents them to access life as everyone else. So, for example, they gave me an example. So a wheelchair user may have any kind of impairment. We might not even know what it is. They could be paraplegic. They could have multiple sclerosis. We don't know. However, the reason why they are disabled is because of barriers in society, in employment, and the built environment. Inaccessible parking, inaccessible toilets, steps, lack of lifts, lack of escalators, all sorts of reasons why they can't actually physically get into a place or get into a virtual environment. So I thought that was really interesting, but it hadn't quite sunk in. So I understood it in a very intellectual way, but I hadn't actually accepted it. So it comes the moment of the mock interview. And what happened was there was a guy pretending to be a, scary employer. And the moment came to me that I had to go up there and introduce myself and talk about me. And this employer, inverted commas, said to me, "But Maria, I can see you've got many qualifications, but how do you expect to work in an office? You cannot even answer the phone." That was like a punch in the stomach for me. I just froze. And then I ran away. I ran out of the room crying. So as I was sitting outside, sitting in a corridor on the floor, crying my eyes out, the tutor comes out, the tutor from the workshop, and he's, sitting down with me on the floor, crashing down with me. I'm crying my eyes out, and he's trying to calm me down. And he's saying, "Maria, remember, we talked about the social model of disability." Yes. But I just couldn't, it just wasn't sinking in. Remember, look, when people look at you, when you can see people in the face and you can lip read, can you understand what they're saying to you? Yes. Okay. So if people tell you something, for example, through your hearing aid, you use an amplified telephone that is really loud and clear, that can help as well, can it? And I said, I stopped crying, and I said, yes. I was feeling a bit hesitant. And he said, if the worst comes to the worst, you really don't understand something, they could write something down, right? And then you can get on with the job. You can work. Yes. Okay, so why can't you do the job? And that light bulb moment, it was just such a seismic shock to me in my head, where I realized actually it's true. If people include me, I am still deaf as a lamppost, but I'm not disabled anymore. And that was incredibly life-changing, literally life-changing, because 3 days later, I had a real interview and I got a job with the British Broadcasting Corporation. I became a production secretary, and it was a life-changing moment. You can imagine back in Italy, my family, looking at this achievement in this belief, and my confidence restored. So from that time, of course, that job changed my life. It kickstarted my career and everything, my passion for all things, disability. But I became almost like an evangelist. Even when I didn't want to work in disability, I ended up teaching people about disability and teaching them about accessibility and inclusion. And so, again, disability confidence has been flowing. And it seems to be like a recurrent theme. So now, recently, it came as a huge surprise to me, following on from my daughter's diagnosis. I am now diagnosed with a neurodiversity that I was really not anticipating or suspecting. I had no idea. And this is quite recent. So in spite of all my experience, I can feel the ebbs and the flows of this disability confidence, where at that moment, a little bit like I find myself in that mock interview, sort of feeling a bit unsure of myself, and I'm working a little bit, and really looking at the past with a lens, with new lenses, and reevaluating everything in the light of this new diagnosis. And so it has been quite a journey. My confidence, again, ebbs and flows, but all I can do is keep trying. So if we go back to the definition of confidence, I just have to keep telling myself, keep trying, keep learning about yourself, keep learning about what works for you, find a way to communicate this to people, and hopefully you'll be okay. And so this is what my journey looks like. And my journey ends really well because my career I've been very blessed with an amazing career. Most recently, I have been shortlisted as a Power 100 disability influencers in the UK twice, in 2019 and 2022. And I am now volunteering. I've been asked to be a judge for that amazing awards, for those amazing awards. And I have the privilege also to be a judge for a head of judges for the READI, which is the Recruitment Industry Disability Initiative, to help guide other judges in evaluating people for the best and most inclusive recruitment practice, particularly around disability. Most recently, I've been, a senior leader for equality, diversity, and inclusion at High Speed 2. I've achieved amazing things. It's been an amazing journey in equality and inclusion. We have, spearheaded so many initiatives in an industry industries such as engineering and construction that are not very diverse to begin with. And then at the time, we achieved the prestigious Clear Assured Equality, Diversity and Inclusion accreditation, which is run by the Clear Company. And that in itself is a major achievement. We submitted over 850 pieces of evidence for that evaluation. And again, HS2 became a role model for the rest of the industry, particularly for our supply chain that employs 30,000 people across 144 miles of track. And so my career has been great, and I've also had the pleasure, the unique honor of having my novel, inspired by my life, published in Italy. So why am I telling you this, all of this? It's because I really hope that you get a sense of how disability confidence is a journey, and that it can take sudden curves and changes, and it ebbs and flows. But I think if you stay at it, if you keep asking, what are the barriers that you're experiencing? Don't feel overwhelmed about all of the barriers that are out there in the world, particularly if you're a service provider, an employer. It can feel quite overwhelming. But if you take a step back and actually start from a curiosity and a humble place, and you just listen to people and ask people, what barriers are you experiencing? What works for you? Talk to me. I'll listen. That would be the best way that you can become disability confident, because you cannot know it all. And I hope that for you, this disability journey will be exactly like has been for me, where you can say for yourself, if you have a disability, or for colleagues with a disability, you can say, yes, I can. Thank you. I now have the pleasure to hand over, I don't know if there are any questions, but I will hand over to James Chavez. Thank you, James.
Thank you. So just checking you can hear me in the room, and hello to everyone online. And I know that after my presentation, we're going to go to a panel discussion. So I think questions for Maria and maybe for me, and also for the panel after that. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about neuro-inclusion. I guess very similar to Maria, there's a personal element to this for me. I have dyspraxia. I'm fortunate in some ways because I knew about it when I was very young, but it has actually been only in the last few years that I think I've really explored it, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that's coincided with my time at the Clear Company. So yeah, I'll just tell you a bit about my journey, but more so about neuro-inclusion. To get started, I wanted to share something. So I recently had an experience having some coaching from a specialist coach who knew all about dyspraxia. And one of the filters, one of the ways we explored it was these three elements. What's your learning style? What's your cognitive processing? Didn't even know what that meant. And how do you react to different stimulus? So I'll touch on those things in my brief presentation, but more powerfully, I wanted to get you thinking about your relationship to these things. So some questions for you. How do you learn? How do you think? And what's the environment that you like to be in? So to do that, I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I'm going to ask you 3 questions in a row. The first one is all about how you would respond if you bought a new device. So I recently bought a hedge trimmer, also considering a leaf blower. It's that time of year. But you could think about a laptop or your phone. How would you get going on that device? So turn to that person next to you, find some groups, whatever it is. And if you're online, if there's someone else in your house, then please speak to them, or just that personal reflection. But how would you get going on that device? Over to you. Yeah, I'd probably do some work. This one's full. So, first one, look at the illustration. Second one, so let's do summary. The third one's read the manual. And the fourth one's just oh, yeah, full. Life is too short. Yeah. Life is too short. Okay, I only have 15 minutes with you, so I'm going to stop you there. But it's great to hear that this generated a lot of discussion. So that was about your learning style, obviously. So what's on the screen, by the way, is just to back up what I'm saying. So I'll always explain what I'm saying as well as the slides. So you might be a visual learner. How many of you were visual learners? How many of you said, yeah, watch somebody else do it, look at the instructions? Yeah, a few of you in the room. What about the auditory learners? So auditory learners, I might listen to somebody doing something. Even if you're watching a YouTube video, it might be that you have that on, but you're really listening to that. Yeah, a few in the room. Reading and writing learners? Yeah. Interestingly, this learning style is the one that I think we do most at school and in education. So I was thinking that, Maria, of what you were saying. And then lastly, how many kinesthetic learners did we have? Even if it was a hedge trimmer? Yeah, that's me as well. But then the problem I had is that the battery wasn't in it. You had to read the instructions to put the battery in it, charge it. Yeah. So that was the first question. That was just about your learning style. Next question I wanted to ask you is about that stimulus. So how do you learn new information? That was the first question. The second one is, if you were working at home on your own, or maybe you're in the office, but you're focused, you're doing solo work, would you sit there in total silence? Is that what you need to focus? Would you have the radio on, or maybe even the TV, some kind of background noise? Or are you the kind of person that needs to put your own music on, your own playlist, your favorite songs? So silence, the radio, the TV, generic sound, or your own personal sound? Again, over to you. Okay, so a few different options there. How many of you said total silence? How distracting would it be if we put loud music on while you try to work? Very, yeah. How many of you can't concentrate in silence? Yeah, I'm like that. So you can almost, the silence is almost distracting. You can almost hear it. Yeah, I can see some nodding in here. And what about the radio, that generic background noise? Maybe even white noise. Yeah, bit of both. Yeah. So the last question I wanted to ask you, and this is that thing about how we process information, that cognitive processing. So let's say that there's a new process that you've got to follow, or you've been given a new task. What works well for you? Somebody calling you, telling you about it. So option one, being told verbally, getting an email, all written out, all the instructions. And this last one, this is not my preference, but using a planning tool. So, you know, that kind of thing where maybe you put tasks in and then you can tick them off, and, you know, those sort of online tools that are designed to increase your productivity. This is the last question, but over to you. How do you want to be given that task, that new task, or that new process? Okay, thank you. So for those of you online as well, don't want to speak directly to you. Hopefully you've had a chance to think about that. You've put together your sort of answers to these three questions. I've asked you three questions there, right? So there's already a lot of different possibilities. So we think that we've created 27 different profiles. So for me, I'm the kind of kinesthetic person. I like to have my own music on. I like tasks explained verbally. We've already created 27 different groups there. How many of you, though, one of the questions you were like, well, it depends a little bit. Yeah. So how many groups have we got? It's infinite. This is what neurodiversity is, right? So this is, that's the reveal of why we've done that. This is what neurodiversity is. We think differently. We react differently to stimulus. Our brains process things differently. So what is neurodiversity? Well, it's recognizing, and again, to Maria's point, celebrating that our brains are different, that they function differently. And it's really important that we understand that neurodiversity is everyone. So although you might not have a neurodivergent condition, and I'll talk about that in a minute, you do have a cognitive profile. We've just explored that. So if you as an organization could be neuro-inclusive, it particularly might benefit those who are neurodivergent and have been left out or excluded, but everybody should benefit. Everybody benefits from a management structure and a way of working where you can be yourself. 15% of the population have a neurodivergent diagnosis. I'm not going to go around the room and ask, how many people do. But we also know that a lot of people are exploring the fact that they might be neurodivergent, haven't been able to access any kind of test. And there might also be some people that are neurodivergent who have no idea, but maybe some of their colleagues or family or friends maybe suspect they do based on their knowledge. And although we try and educate around this, it's quite hard to do what we call neurodiversity awareness, so just telling you about it, because it's so different for everyone. There's a great phrase, if you've met a neurodivergent person, you've met a neurodivergent person. And although there are common symptoms, or I shouldn't actually call them symptoms, but common things you might notice, actually they could be different for everyone. So how do we support that? Well, what is neurodivergence? I'd said that neurodiversity is everyone. Neurodivergence, or people that have a neurodivergent diagnosis, are people like me who have dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autism, and all sorts of other things, dyscalculia, and a few others. And although we can't generalize completely, just in this 10 or so minutes I've got left, there's a few things that I wanted to reference ahead of then talking about how we can support and be neuro-inclusive. So hopefully this visual is telling a story and you can see it if you're online. But what we've got here is a sort of midpoint line. So if I draw a line right down the middle and we say that's sort of completely average, no one fits into that group, right? We all go up and down. We're all strong in some areas, less strong in other areas. Neurodivergent people typically, and again, I'm not saying always, but typically, worth saying, will sometimes experience what we call a spiky profile. So really good at some stuff right up here, then something else really struggle with. And actually, within the social model of disability that you spoke of, that can cause problems. Because it might be that you can't do an entry-level role because some of the tasks you can't do, even though some of the tasks you could do at a really high standard. It could also mean that in an environment where there's a focus on the negative, or it's a very strong compliance culture, that actually being bad at some things is actually, more of a disadvantage than the great strength that you bring. This is just something we wanted to explain. My instinct now is to say any questions on that, but we'll do questions later. But hopefully that's clear. So the spiky profile, I often talk about in the context of recruitment. So you might find you've got someone that's absolutely outstanding for 4 out of the 5 criteria that you've identified. And actually you might think, do we need them to do that 5th criteria, or can we be more innovative with how we put that together? It might be that an understanding manager, where I'm lucky to have, says, James, don't worry, I'll do the invoices for you. You don't need to do the invoices because it takes me too long. They have mistakes in them. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Another thing we wanted to share, and the Clear Company do a full workshop on this. I've done it a couple of times this week. The kind of thing we would cover is common strengths that neurodivergent people might have, because I didn't know this until I had the coaching, but all of my skills, all of my strengths are all as common as the things I find hardest within dyspraxia. And that genuinely was a surprise to me, because I thought, well, I take all the credit for my strengths, dyspraxia is to blame for all my problems. That's not the case. So there are common strengths, so we can explore those. But equally, there are common challenges, and a few that I can just briefly mention. Masking, the effort that you might make to conceal your neurodivergence or to act outside of your natural way of communicating, learning, whatever it is. Stimming, something you might have heard of, but that can be physical gestures that you use to regulate your emotions. So I'll talk in more detail about that. And actually, I was very touched during your speech, Maria, about thinking just on that point of trauma, but the experience that neurodivergent people might have had growing up in a context that maybe didn't understand or fully embrace their unique mind. So we'll talk about those in more detail. But for now, I wanted to leave you with a few things that you can do right away to create a more neuro-inclusive environment. The first one is to normalize neurodiversity. So actually, if you're a leader, make sure that everybody in your team knows that they can work within reason how they want, that they can have music on, that they don't have to have music on. And actually acknowledging as the leader that you're a neurodiverse person. You have specific ways of thinking and working. And I think we've moved away from this, but certainly when I've had jobs where you have to do exactly what your manager does, that's exactly how things get done. But normalizing an environment where that's not the case can be really helpful. Something the Clear Company talk about a lot is how do we create psychological safety? So an environment where you can be yourself, where failure doesn't feel like the absolute end, where you can ask questions, where you know that non-inclusive behavior, so bullying or jokes at the expense of someone's neurodivergence, would be challenged. And another thing we can do is encourage flexibility and variety as a standard part of how we work. So although it might not be because someone's neurodivergent, actually it benefits a neurodivergent person if they see that people work flexibly. Does that make sense? So actually just seeing that that's part of your culture is automatically inclusive for neurodivergent people. And I do advise that, where you can, you improve your awareness and are curious. So you might, there's a huge variety of neurodivergent diagnosis, and it might be that you've never worked with somebody before with dyslexia, dyspraxia. Don't feel the pressure to learn about all of them, and also be aware that, it will be different for everybody. But if, for example, somebody in your team said, I have dyslexia, a little bit of research could go a long way, and then a genuinely curious attitude about how they work is the rest of the puzzle. And in a way, this is the slide I'm proudest of, and actually I've got a lot more of these as well. But these are some great questions to ask people who are neurodivergent, and I've tested these with a few of my neurodivergent colleagues and in other workshops and had some really positive feedback. So ask your neurodivergent colleagues these questions. If you've had adjustments before, how did they work for you? And how can we improve on them? What do you want people to know about how you work? What's the story we can tell your colleagues? How do you like to receive feedback? How can we create a suitable work environment for you? And I'm guessing that some of you are listening to these and going, oh, I like those questions. I wish someone would ask me them. And yeah, exactly. So although these will massively benefit your neurodivergent colleagues, they will benefit everyone. So that's really the message I want you to take away. Neuro-inclusion is for everyone, but within that, we've got these neurodivergent people, myself included, that may have had that trauma that Maria explained so well of, thinking that they're worse or they're less because of how society was set up. So adapt that neuro-inclusive approach. You'll particularly help your neurodivergent colleagues, but everyone will benefit. Last thing to mention, and it would be wrong of me not to mention this, coming from the Clear company, but it's also important to have that intersectional awareness of how this can work. So I'm very aware that although I'm neurodivergent, I have a lot of other privileges. One of my parents is a teacher, come from a stable family, and I've also got the benefits of being white and a man, the confidence, and maybe the lack of imposter syndrome there. So it's important that we understand that. Masking manifests differently. We know that some people have covered neurodivergent conditions for their whole life, and it wasn't noticed. Psychological safety is also something to just have in mind, because if your psychological safety is negatively affected by discrimination because of your gender or ethnicity, it's that bit harder maybe to advocate for yourself and your particular cognitive profile. Privilege comes into it, as I explained. And like I said, I think for me, the ultimate privilege I had was firstly being diagnosed because my parents were aware because they were teachers, and latterly being able to afford to have that coaching, which was that life-changing thing for me. And also just being mindful that awareness is different in different, communities, different parts of the world. So that's it. But as I say, the message I want to leave you with is, we'd love to talk to you more about this as a topic, and thank you to Lloyd's and other organisations who have already had us do that. But neuro-inclusivity benefits everyone, but it's the solutions that are positive for everybody will particularly benefit your neurodivergent employees who might be struggling or might have those concerns that Maria put so well. So that's it from me for now. So I'm going to hand to Kate, who's going to lead us in a talk with a brilliant panel, and I'm going to go to the back and moderate some questions. But yeah, I'm going to hand to Kate now. So thank you so much.
I've got one. Can you hear me? Yep, great. I've got a mic. And great, give a visually impaired person a load of notes, lots of names to remember and a series of questions, and it's all going to go really well. I'm probably holding it upside down. So my name's Kate Headley. I'm one of the executive directors at the Clear company, and I'm really proud to be partnering with Lloyd's in terms of their inclusion journey. And for the second year running, working with Sarah to promote disability inclusion across the market as part of IVIN. So thank you for having me again. We obviously got it reasonably right last year. And I won't be asking you all about what you've done in between, in the last 12 months just yet, although you might want to leave the room in a hurry, because I probably will before the end of the session. But it's my absolute privilege to introduce you to a panel of people who have a visual impairment or sight loss, including myself, and we're spotlighting those talented people. And they're kind enough and generous enough to share not only their personal experiences, but how their employment experience impacts on their ability to perform and to be their true selves, and therefore provide that optimal performance across the market, which we're all seeking to achieve through our talented colleagues. Just to let you know, we can't control the weather. So the flooding in the Midlands means that we have a video clip from Robin, who wasn't able to get on a train through the Midlands, and we're hoping that will work, so forgive us for that. But all of the panel are visually impaired, because that's the aspect of disability that the Lloyd's Foundation is championing this year. If anybody wants to learn more or get more involved in that, there are lots of opportunities to do so, and I encourage you to do so, please. But just some facts as to why the Foundation has chosen this particular aspect of disability. Because the employment gap in an entire generation for people with a visual impairment hasn't changed at all in a whole generation. And that's not the same for any other form of disability. So there's clearly something we need to do a little bit differently around that. And as somebody with acquired sight loss, so I started to lose my sight about 10 years ago, having gone to an Action for Blind People event at the House of Lords, by the way. So I now want to go to Weight Watchers and under-21s and see what happens if I go to those. But it was just after that I went there to learn more about visual impairment. And I learned then that 76% is the employment rate of people who don't have a disability, particularly in the UK. That's the sort of average employment rate. It drops to 51% if you have a disability of any sort, and it drops to just above 20% if you have a visual impairment. And somebody visually impaired with a degree and a master's potentially has the same level of opportunity to get into employment as somebody without any qualifications who is not visually impaired. So we've got all that talent that this panel is going to share with you, And then we're going to have questions, because you've heard a lot. And I'm sure you're desperate to ask Maria and James and Sarah and others questions, and you will have the opportunity. But could I welcome the panel to these really interesting chairs that all of us with visual impairments are going to entertain you by getting on and off. So if you'd like to all come up, and then we'll quickly introduce ourselves, if that's all right. Please take a seat. I've got that mic up, thank you. We're going to have, it's all very well prepared. So we've got a mic on either side, and we'll pass it amongst ourselves, if that's all right. So you've met me. I'm obviously the chair of the panel. I don't have to do very much other than ask the difficult questions. And then we've got Andrew.
Hello.
You're over there. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
And you.
And we've got Martin, who's over
Hey.
here. And then we've got Robin, who will be on a video. We've got Becky. We can call her Rebecca, but then she thinks it's a Sunday. And we've got Michael. So I'm going to start asking them some questions, if that's all right. Is everybody ready? Okay. And I'm going to start with you, Andrew. So, Andrew, what changes we've seen over the past few years with the impact of COVID is this hybrid working. And also we've got hybrid eventing today and across the next 3 days. And for some people that works really well and has been a real advantage and a door opener, in fact, for certain people with different disabilities and different life experiences. But for others, it's been quite challenging. It'd be really interesting to hear from you, your perspective on, you know, what can you share with our audience today as employers that they can do in their employment practices to make sure that we include everybody?
Yep, thank you very much. I think, as you just said, the new way of working, we're seeing it in action here today, person and online. I mean, from my perspective, I firmly believe that the new way of working that we're all experiencing does actually bring a huge opportunity for many disabled people to access employment opportunities, particularly for those who may have difficulty accessing public transport to get to work, for example, or people with more limited mobility. So I really hope that as time goes on, some of those statistics that were just being quoted there are still very frightening from, you know, us visually impaired people's perspective. But from my point of view, I work hybridly, and it works very well for me. I would say there are a few advantages. The main one is very much around getting to work, as I'm sure we can all sort of empathise with. It immediately just reduces that sort of stress of the daily commute, which I'm sure you can imagine as a disabled person, it can be a little bit amplified. It also enables me to work more flexibly around medical appointments, for example, family life, although my kids are now grown up and left home. But also it just helps me to manage my work schedule, which is very busy as a company secretary, to manage that around the needs of my disability. So to avoid fatigue, to avoid excessive eye strain, for example. So just going back to that daily commute, I mean, a real life example I can give is, you know, I live quite a long way out to the north of London, been commuting by train 35 years now, very used to it. But we all know things go wrong, and I don't have that alternative option when the trains are not running. I can't just jump into a car, drive to the nearest station. So just having that ability to make the decision, if I take one look at my departure board and say, no, thank you, just having that flexibility in the background just makes a huge difference for me personally. And I would say that's probably the biggest advantage. Talk about disadvantages, working more remotely. I think the obvious one is that connection with people in the office. There really is nothing like just those coffee machine moments, those chats that we all have in the kitchen informally. They're just great moments. But another disadvantage that I think I found, and it probably reflects that I'm aging slightly, is it's introduced a whole new raft of technology that has taken some getting used to. And I'm not being anti-tech because obviously I do my job involving a lot of tech. But we're all now having to use, WebEx, Teams, Zoom, whatever it is. Now, when I first started using that, I was struggling because I access a computer through software, which basically magnifies my screen to a very, very high level. So I'm only ever seeing a very small part of the screen at any one time. So the only way I can navigate around is by moving my mouse around, trying to find where all the various navigation tools are. Where's the next button? Where's the submit button? And we're all having to use a lot more applications in our jobs and outside of our jobs. And from my perspective, the way I deal with that is by building up a kind of map within my mind, so that when I'm in an application, I might be thinking, well, I know that the mute button is in a particular place, or I know that the next button is somewhere else. So the more technology we have to deal with in these daily activities can be very, very challenging. So I would say that's really the main sort of disadvantage. So my main message really, I think, for employers generally is, as has already been said in these fascinating talks, we're all different. We all have different needs. Sometimes we need a little bit more time to get used to a system. And I would say have those open conversations that have already been mentioned here today, because the more knowledge that we can all share between ourselves, that can only be a positive thing. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Bang on time as well.
Oh,
absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And also, yet another example of a very senior, accomplished individual with sight loss operating in the market. So it's achievable, which is always good. You mentioned the commute, which is interesting because Michael and I were talking earlier, and I don't think I've said this to any of my colleagues, but you use the word flustered. When we're on train platforms or in crowded areas, you can get a bit flustered, was the term you used. And it does, because when somebody has sight loss in a busy environment, the information just layers on top of each other itself repeatedly. So you get layer after layer of information and you get a little bit panicky. So that's just something to be aware of. It can make such a significant difference not being in a busy environment if you need to do something that you need your brain for, because your brain will just try and cope with the external environment.
Yeah.
Anyway, you mentioned technology. Brilliant segue into introducing the video, if we may, that Robin Christopherson has recorded for us. Because if there was anybody who knows stuff about digital, it will be Robin. So I'm going to tell you the question that Robin's going to answer. Because I've worked with Robin on and off over a couple of decades, probably, which is a little bit scary. And some time ago, I'm going to say, he did a demonstration for what was then the biggest assessment house in the world. So you'll probably, if anybody's in HR, you'll know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to mention them because it's like the BBC. And they thought they'd got this really inclusive assessment process, as do lots of assessment houses these days, by the way, who do not. And so Robin, who operates, he's completely blind. He operates with his iPhone and an AirPod and goes around the world doing his job with those two things. Showed this company actually what was going on in his ear when they thought he was going through like one line of text on a website. And it was just unbelievable, the jaw-dropping of the technicians in the room. So my question to Robin is, as that was probably over a decade ago, I'm hoping he can share with us some technological advances that suggest that things are a little bit better these days. And that's the question I put to him, that he's kindly dashed back in the pouring rain and recorded for us today. Oh.
Today, in answer to Kate's question, I certainly do remember that time at SHL 10 years or so ago. Have we moved on a lot in these recent years? Well, websites and apps are somewhat better, but certainly day-to-day inaccessibility really is still an issue. And even though we've got fantastic technology, so for me, for example, all my devices talk. I've got my phone here that talks, my watch talks. I've got some snazzy sunglasses here that talk to me as well. These are the Bose frames. And while I'm out and about, I'm using apps that tell me where I am, when to turn left or right or cross the street, what things I'm passing, and they come into my ears through these Bose frames, Bluetooth sunglasses, basically. And because my ears are still open, then I am not compromising safety. I will still be able to hear traffic, etc. So we've come on a long way with regards to technology. But yes, websites and apps are still not 100% accessible. A recent survey by WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, that's webaim.org, showed that nearly 98% of home pages of websites that they scanned for accessibility didn't even meet the base level. So yes, we're still in that neck of the woods, guys, unfortunately. We can't not talk about AI. AI is obviously everywhere, and it is going to play a big part going forward. AI will be helping coders to make more accessible apps and websites. If you haven't checked out GitHub Copilot for VS Code, you absolutely should do that. It will really help create better code and more accessible code as well. Even something like the accessibility checker in the Office apps now is really powerful and leverages AI to help create more accessible documents. But AI will also be will help end users like myself to recognize unlabeled buttons, etc., and hopefully very soon even be able to perform actions for us. So rather than ourselves having to tackle complicated and often inaccessible websites or apps, we can just ask it to do the clicking or the form filling for us, or even just say, book some flights for us, and then it will go away and do that as well. So AI is going to be super powerful going forward. There are still some downsides though. So AI overlays, you may have heard of accessibility overlays that leverage AI. I'm not going to name any names, but be very, very careful. Anything that purports to be a silver bullet when it comes to website accessibility, let us do it by adding on this simple thing so that you don't have to bother about accessibility yourselves. Don't touch those with a barge pole. In many cases, they actually degrade the accessibility, the end user experience. So yeah, AI has its pitfalls as well. And obviously, when it comes to a broader use of AI, like any tool, especially really powerful ones, then it will be used for extreme good and also for extreme ill as well. So we all know about fake news, etc. You can't really trust any image, video or audio or picture that you see on the internet these days. So that is a huge problem, obviously. In its use in recruitment, for example, where you would have a robot assessor rather than a human who will have a video assessment with you, it won't take into account the fact that you might need extra time, or that you might have a stammer, for example, and it would have difficulty understanding what you're saying. Alarming research has shown that these robot assessors will mark people down if you're a woman. They'll mark you down if you're wearing glasses. They'll mark you up if you smile, but down if you don't. If you're wearing a headscarf or a hijab, then it will mark you down as well. So there are many instances where the bias of humans and human prejudice that was used to train the large language models that AI uses these days has all been brought in. And so these AI models that we're using in ever increasing applications have all the biases and prejudices that humans have as well. And obviously there have been some horrendous examples in the past where you would have people of color and gorillas, for example, coming up in the same image searches. So yeah, we're thankfully past those days now. Maria earlier on, I think, will have mentioned about the use of blind. And I certainly will concur with that, because using the word blind in everyday language 9 times out of 10 is in a derogatory, pejorative term. So blind drunk, blind rage, blind ignorance, etc. So yeah, really, really negative. And all of that has been brought into the kind of intelligence of AI. And so it will have all of those prejudices as well. I asked an AI recently, can you describe this image better for me because I'm blind? And it started off its response by saying, I'm sorry, you're blind, etc., etc. So yeah, we're still have a long way to go when it comes to enlightened and inclusive AI, but it certainly has a huge upside potential for helping people with a range of impairments as well. Thanks very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
It's like he's in the room, isn't it? So I want to say thank you, Robin, and give him a round of applause. Amazing. But thank you, Robin. So Robin's head of digital accessibility for AbilityNet, and travels globally promoting digital inclusion, and has some very funny stories, which we will share another time. Becky, may I turn to you now? So as I've already mentioned, I'm partially sighted as well. And one of the challenges I've had is about people one day feeling very confident around me and the next day not quite knowing what to say. So locally, I went through about 4 years of wherever I went out, which is normally the pub, frankly, in the spirit of transparency. People would meet me immediately with, how are your eyes? How are your eyes? I'm from the north, by the way. And so for me, what's really helped is working with people like yourselves in the room who are much more confident about what they can say and what they can ask. It's made a real difference. And I know you've got some really good perspectives on the importance of being disability confident around colleagues, the importance of being an ally, and the things that have made a difference for you, Becky.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kate. So being disability confident, very similar actually to what Maria was talking about earlier, it definitely ebbs and flows. And I'd like to speak about a few sort of more positive experiences that I've had and also some less positive experiences. As background to that, I'd like to just talk about something that happened outside of my working life, but during the commute, because I think it's really important context to understand what can affect our confidence coming into the workplace and the kind of prejudices and biases that exist. So many years ago, before smartphones were able to kind of help us navigate the world, catching the train home from work one day where the only way to tell which platform your train was at would be to go and speak to the person in the information booth and ask them kindly, could you please tell me which platform train XYZ to my home is going from? Anyway, this particular day I was met with a very pleasant man who looked at me completely unimpressed and said, well, it's on the board. And I had to explain, well, yes, I know it's on the board, but actually I have a visual impairment and I can't read what's on the board. To which he replied, oh, I'm sorry, your train is at platform 5. I was mortified, as you can imagine. But it's that unconscious bias that, you know, I told him I had a visual impairment, not that I was stupid, but that's one of the things that I think we've probably all experienced, those kind of things. And so when you go into the workplace and you need to ask your colleagues for help, because we can't avoid it in some cases, that's in the back of your mind going, if I ask for help, do you think I'm stupid? Am I less employable? Am I going to be put forward to lead that project? And that all goes in the back of your mind. So to your point, Kate, about allyship, having colleagues that understand what you need, that have taken the time to ask you those genuinely insightful questions is really important. And I think Robin made the point actually about the word blind being used in a derogative way, and that's definitely true. What I worry about is that people, for fear of saying the wrong thing, that they don't say anything. And that creates a culture where talking about disability is a taboo. And none of us benefit from that kind of culture. And that's why I think it's really important to have a disability confident employer who understands that we can have these conversations because it helps everybody, not just the person with the disability.
Thanks, Becky. And there's a real theme going on here, isn't there, about asking the questions. And I can't encourage everybody to do that. If there's one small thing you do differently tomorrow or later on today, is just think about the questions that you ask in those situations that you've avoided because you're a little bit unsure as to how to go into them. And I can actually share an example that might resonate with you that I had with Robin a few years ago. We were at a conference and somebody came up to me and said, I'd really like to meet Robin. How do I say hello to him? And I said to them, well, hello would generally work, actually. But if you want a bit more confidence, then hello, Robin, I am, because he won't see who you are. It's just a little bit of extra bonus. But, don't grab him by the arm. Or what they were planning to do was just avoid speaking to somebody that they needed some intelligence from, because they were really unsure about how to address him as somebody who couldn't see because they hadn't got that lived experience. So I think it's okay. So I'm giving everybody in the room and on the screens permission to ask a question, even if it's clumsy, even if it's not quite right, and say, is there something I need to know? What can I do to help? And if it's nothing, that's fine. And if somebody gets a bit numpty about it, that's also fine, because the integrity of your questioning was correct. So I'd encourage all of you to do that. And I think what everybody's saying today is do that and be aware of it, because then all the stuff about the technology that's been introduced, they'll answer the question for you. So you can then go down that route as well. So, which is quite a good segue into our next panellist. So introducing Martin from RNIB, who all the employers and our disabled colleagues in the room, be delighted to know, have a raft of things that can support colleagues and employers. And Martin's going to tell us a little bit about that, and also a little bit of a shared experience, I think.
Thank you, Kate. And yes, I'm the head of employment services with RNIB. So for anyone who doesn't know the charity, we are the UK leading charity supporting people with sight loss. But I must say and point out, I don't have sight loss myself, but I work with lots of people who do. And I've worked over the years with hundreds of people who are working in a range of professions who have sight loss. So I just want to share with you a few messages and then a bit about how we can help you as employers to employ people. So firstly, being blind or partially sighted should not mean that you can't find a job or you can't stay in a job. Blind or partially sighted people are doing a range of professions. They may do them a bit differently. They may use a piece of technology to support them to do it, or some administrative support, but they're doing them very successfully. People with sight loss are working as journalists, lawyers, teachers, bankers, CEOs of companies, entrepreneurs, the list goes on. Kate mentioned earlier that the employment rate is so very, very low. And yes, it's true, and it hasn't really changed over the last 10 years. The most common barrier to employment reported by people with sight loss who we would talk to at RNIB is the perceived attitudes of employers who just don't know how to support someone and therefore are reluctant to recruit people into their organisation. So maybe not deliberately, but they just don't have the information at hand. But as an employer, there are some simple steps that you can take to encourage more people into your organisation and to keep them in work. And Maria talked earlier about, you don't need to be an expert in hearing loss. You don't need to know it all. And it's the same for sight loss. You do not need to be an expert in sight loss to work with people with sight loss and to encourage them to work with you. So we've asked people who've used our services before, what are the things that make it easier for you to apply for a job and would encourage you to work for a company? And there are 6 things. The first one is make your website accessible. Make sure that wherever you advertise jobs, someone with sight loss can find the role and apply for it. The second one is that you look at your job application, that someone can read the application and fill it in using whatever technology they need. The third one is around staff awareness, and that's just making sure that staff have a very basic understanding of sight loss and how it might affect someone. The fourth one is your interview process. Do you ask someone coming for an interview, do you need any adjustments? The fifth one is around your IT systems, looking at are they accessible with software that someone with sight loss might use? And then the sixth one is looking at the future potential for someone that works in your organisation. Do they have the same career aspirations? Now, the thing is, you don't need to be on your own to do this, and there's help out there. So RNIB have a quality standard called Visibly Better Employer, and it checks these. We can check your website, we can check your processes and give you some help. But in doing that, you will encourage more people with sight loss into your organisation and keep them there. So what I would ask you to think about today is if you don't employ people with sight loss, you're missing out. There's a huge pool of talent, and they're probably not applying for jobs with you because they're not sure if you're supportive to them working with you, and maybe they just can't find the job advertisements. So check with RNIB, look at our employment page, and you will see how you can make very simple adjustments. And you will find that more people with sight loss will apply for jobs with you. We don't have time for, sometimes at these point we would do a small workshop to give you a personal experience of sight loss in a small way. But on the screen, we have got some eye conditions. So James had mentioned earlier about neurodivergence and that it's not the same for everyone. And sight loss is not the same for everyone, for two people. Two people with the same eye condition could see two different things. But there are some common eye conditions that you may or may not be aware of, and we're showing some of those on the screen today. So a few would be, one's called age-related macular degeneration, so you tend to get it as you get older. And the important thing about having an eye condition is it's not the name of it or the fancy scientific pronunciation. It's what does it mean for you? How does it affect you? So if you're working with someone with sight loss or you're wanting to know how you might adjust a job, just ask them, what can you see? How does your sight loss affect you? They'll tell you. So if someone has macular degeneration, it may cause loss of central vision. If you've got glaucoma, you may lose the side vision in the earlier stages. So that means adaptations may need to be put in place for those eye conditions. If we move just to the second slide. So two other ones, you're probably familiar with cataracts. It's a very preventable eye condition, but it can cause a screen to be blurry or misty. So that could be affected by lighting in the room. Or diabetic retinopathy, which affects the blood vessels at the back of the eye. But what that means is it can lead to patchy or central vision. So what this means is that if you've one of these eye conditions, you may need to use some magnification on your screen. You may need to use a screen reader, but you may not need any of those because two conditions are not the same. Maybe you just need a light bulb taken out in a room, which makes the room a bit lighter, a bit dimmer, or some low lighting at your desk, which could change things for someone. I'll give you a very simple example about someone we helped to stay in a job who was going to leave their job, and they were very much affected by glare on their computer. And an assessment was done through occupational health to see how someone would sort the eye condition. And the solution that was put in place was to move the computer away from the window to the other side of the office. And that ended the glare, and they continued to work successfully. So all adjustments don't need to be complicated. They don't need to be expensive. But you do need to ask the person, what do you need? And there's plenty of help out there. So that's the last part. I've just a quick mention to say that what we do with Visibly Better Employer, it's just one element of an industry-wide collaboration that we're working on at the moment with IICF, which is the Insurance Industry Charitable Foundation. So we've been collaborating with the IICF and a number of corporate partners over the last few months. And we would really welcome wider collaboration in how we can get more people with sight loss into the insurance sector. So if you're interested in that, please look at the IICF website or speak to Wendy Wilder, who's here today, or you can get the details online for further advice. I've probably spoken for too long, Kate.
That's all right. That's all
right.
Yeah, we are at the end of time, but we'll run over a bit because we started a little bit later. So hopefully we'll give them permission to do that. But without further ado, I'm going to move on to you, Michael, as yet another professional working in this market with sight loss. And our question to you is Is the market culturally ready, do you think, for people with a visual impairment or sight loss, or is there more that we can do?
Hi, everyone. I'm wildly optimistic about where the market is. I lost my sight when I was 19, so about 15 years ago now. And the paradigm shift that I've noticed in technology and awareness within HR professionals and wider workplaces is absolutely monumental. I didn't know anyone who'd lost their sight when I lost my sight, and within 4 weeks I wasn't able to independently read, so I had to rely on screen readers. I was at medical school at the time, had to leave there. So I wrote to the only person I knew with a visual impairment, and that was David Blunkett, who was Home Secretary at the time. He was very generous with his time and allowed me into the Houses of Parliament, but I saw someone who was completely blind operating at the top of the country, really, with assistance through a Perkins brailler. An hour later, I was still on the tube with David Blunkett's Perkins brailler and had to get my head round how to use that. But thankfully, technology has moved on hugely since then. So now I operate in the private equity world, in the legal world, head up a team at Revantage, which is Blackstone's property arm, work with many insurance professionals on a daily basis. And everyone that I work with knows about my visual impairment. I can't get away with operating in my workplace without it, because it's hugely transactional and normally involves people running as fast as they can down an office. So that's a bit strange, but everyone doesn't have an experience of working with someone who's visually impaired. So the two previous employers that I've had have taken the same stance as my current employer, which is we don't know anything about this, but we'll speak to the RNIB or we'll speak to the Vision Foundation or Blind in Business, amazing charities out there, for tips how to work with someone with a visual impairment. And after that, you disarm the people that you work with from sort of asking awkward questions, not knowing about your visual impairment, and in a way you've dissolved some of the awkwardness about you having to explain it to people. So people are providing things to you in the right format. People are providing you description when they're presenting. It's very, very small, subtle tweaks that enable me to operate very quickly. Technology has been, as has been covered, is really the great enabler. When I first lost my sight, I had a Nokia phone which could read the odd text message out now. And now, you know, we're able to use the technology that Robin demonstrated. You know, I've got a talking washing machine at home, a talking can opener. Everything speaks to me in my office. And because of the transition to Microsoft Teams, it's absolutely incredible. It always used to be really awkward being in meetings, clients coming in, asking why. You know, I was sat there with a laptop, everyone sort of got a contract in the middle of the table pointing at it. But now, you know, you'll have 8 meetings back to back, Microsoft Teams, things on screen. I'll have a Word document up on screen at the same time. And most people that I work with didn't know I had a visual impairment until, you know, I've run a marathon for a sight loss charity, or you do something basically that demonstrates to you explicitly that you do have a visual impairment. So technology is amazing. And just something else I would like to mention, for anyone who's into podcasting, Dan Snow's History Hit, amazing, because there's a podcast episode recently which went into all of the big historical events that have happened throughout time involving blind people. And really interestingly, blind people have been viewed at two ends of the spectrum. It's either a very pejorative stereotype or one that is sort of shrouded with mystery and an oracle sort of nature, which is interesting. That feeds into the sometimes, you know, diabolical perception of sight loss, all-pervading, multifaceted, etc. But I can safely say now, I view employment, it's obviously a complicated landscape from a disability point of view, but I see many employers now with really informative, non-generic disability statements on their websites, HR teams who are really willing to help, not knowing the experience, but willing to help. And I see technology as something that has massively changed the sort of lived experiences of people with sight loss in the UK. So we've also got an amazing legislative backdrop in this country, better than I would say any country in the world. And that gives the people with disabilities and visual impairment, a huge amount of confidence that you've got that Equality Act there as well. So it's a very complicated picture, but I'm.
Great note to end on from the panel. Thank you very much for that, Michael. Can I just say thank you very much to the panel. I don't know who's actually in charge here today, but are we allowed to have any questions, or should we take questions?
Well, I guess it depends on the audience.
Yeah.
If you want to stay and ask questions, then please do. It's just if we start to leave,
Yeah.
it's a bit disconcerting. So
Yeah.
I guess it's up to the panel.
Yeah. Well, have we got any questions through, or just open it now? So, if you've got any questions for anybody who's spoken today, if you want to download the QR code and post them to us. We might have the opportunity to take a couple today, but if not, then what we'll try and do is answer them and send them out with anything that, to people who've attended today. So we'll keep.
If I could just add, Kate, I forgot earlier to say, at the back of the room, if you have time before you leave, there are a few sets of simulation glasses where you can try on one of the glasses, and it'll give you a sense of what one of the eye conditions we spoke about earlier would be like, and maybe try and look at your phone or look at a job website using that, give you a bit of an understanding. So thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Anything coming through, James? No? Do you want to sum up then, Sarah?
Thank you. I've been making notes because my instruction was to just get some closing remarks that I gathered from everything that was being said. Top left, even before we'd got past about the first 5 minutes, I'd written wow. And actually that's kind of what I want to finish on, just wow. I talked about being inspired and educated, and I am going away far more educated than I came into this, and multiply more inspired by it. Maria, you talked about being deaf but not disabled. That just resonated and stayed with me. We've heard if you've met a neurodivergent person, you've met a neurodivergent person. Don't think that everybody's the same. We've talked about the benefits for neurodivergent people being benefits to us all. A fantastic end there, thank you, in terms of the optimism and the fact that we are improving, we are getting better. But we heard about technology, and surely to goodness, if my phone knows that my daughter's getting married and has now flooded everything I have with wedding stuff, we can work out some of the tech stuff we've got to do to make accessibility better. That just takes intent, I think. But brilliant to hear about the paradigm shift. Kate, thank you for the reminder that we should just ask questions. It was one of the first things Mark taught me, actually, when him and I started working together. Mark Lomas, our head of culture, which is people don't mind if you ask questions. Because I was like, how am I supposed to address people? I keep getting lost in all of the diversity changes and how people want. And he said, just say, how would you prefer me to address you? And as long as they see and it comes with the right intent, then it's fine. I think we all just avoid things, and Kate talked about that. So I'm not going to go on. I don't want to spoil what's been an amazing session. Just thank you to everybody. It was really, really wonderful. And this is why I'm the sponsor of the disability community. I'm very proud to be that. So thank you very much, everybody.